Hi guys, tonight we're quietly stepping into the life of a man whose name became a blueprint for one of the most infamous financial schemes in history. In the next moments, we'll slowly follow the rise of Charles Ponzi, a dreamer who promised unbelievable profits and built an empire on fragile illusions. This won't be a dramatic retelling. Instead, it's a calm walk through the soft edges of ambition, hope, and the consequences that followed. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. As we begin, let's drift gently into the world where confidence was currency and trust was the most valuable investment. Charles Ponzi's story starts long before the headlines, long before his name became shorthand for deception. He was born Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi in Lugo, Italy, in 1882, into a family that once had comfort but had slowly fallen into modest circumstances. From childhood, he carried a mix of charm and restlessness, traits that would follow him through every chapter of his life. Ponzi grew up hearing stories of fortunes built far away, particularly in America, a place painted with dreams of endless opportunity. The more he listened, the more he felt an itch for something bigger than the life laid out before him. By the time he was a young adult, he saw no path in Italy that matched the size of his aspirations. In his quiet moments, he imagined a future shaped not by limitations but by daring choices. And so, in 1903, with only a few dollars in his pocket and a heart full of hope, he boarded a ship headed for the United States. The journey across the Atlantic was long and crowded, filled with people chasing similar dreams. But Ponzi wasn't discouraged. The sea air, the murmur of passengers, and the distant promise of a new world made him believe he was stepping towards something extraordinary. When he arrived in Boston, the city was bustling, layered with noise, opportunity, and uncertainty. Ponzi didn't speak English well, didn't have connections, and didn't have a job lined up. But he had an unshakable confidence that somehow, some way, he would find a path upward. Those early years weren't glamorous. Ponzi took whatever work he could find, dishwashing, clerking, small jobs that kept him afloat, but never satisfied his hunger for something greater. Each night, he walked through the city streets, imagining the life he would someday claim. He studied people, watched how money moved, and slowly realized that understanding trust was as important as understanding numbers. All these experiences, though ordinary at the time, quietly shaped the man he was becoming. When Charles Ponzi looked back on his first years in America, he often described them as a long stretch of wandering between hope and hardship, a period where nothing seemed certain except his determination to keep moving forward. He drifted from city to city, sometimes following rumors of work, sometimes chasing small opportunities that faded as quickly as they appeared. What kept him going wasn't luck or steady progress, but an inner confidence that something greater was waiting just beyond the next corner. In New York, he found himself surrounded by towering buildings and fast-talking businessmen, a world that felt thrilling but unreachable. He worked small jobs, rarely earning enough to stay comfortable. Yet he absorbed everything around him. He watched how people negotiated, how they spoke about investments, how confidence alone could shift the direction of a conversation. Later, he would say that this was the period that taught him the most, not through classes or books, but through observing human nature in motion. Eventually, circumstances pushed him south, and Ponzi ended up in Montreal, a city whose charm and energy quickly captured him. He found work at a bank owned by Luigi Zarossi, an Italian who had built a reputation in the immigrant community by offering high interest rates on deposits. For Ponzi, this job felt like a doorway into the world he had always imagined. Polished desks, respectable suits, and numbers that hinted at fortune. But beneath the surface, the bank was struggling, relying on new deposits to pay old promises. Ponzi noticed the irregularities, the delays, the quiet tension in the office. Yet he was too fascinated by the illusion of success to walk away. When the bank eventually collapsed, Zarossi disappeared, leaving Ponzi without work and in the middle of a city where trust had suddenly evaporated. The shock of losing everything again pushed him into a desperate situation. Facing unpaid bills and limited options, he made a poor decision that would follow him for years. He altered a cheque for a small amount of money, convinced he could repay it before anyone noticed. He didn't intend to cause harm. He simply felt cornered, and in that moment the wrong choice felt like the only path forward. But it was discovered, and Ponzi was arrested, marking his first serious encounter with the law. Prison was a quiet place, filled with long hours to think. Ponzi used that time to reflect on his missteps, but also to study people even more closely. He learned multiple languages, read whatever books he could find, and tried to reshape his image in his own mind. Not as a failure, but as someone preparing for a second chance. When he was finally released, he stepped into the world with renewed determination. He told himself that he would rebuild his life honestly, that he would find a way to use his charm, intelligence, and energy for something meaningful. But life had a strange way of leading him toward crossroads he didn't expect, and one of those crossroads was already waiting for him on the horizon. When Charles Ponzi walked out of prison after his first sentence, he carried little more than a determination to start over, though the world he stepped into felt heavier than the one he had left behind. He wandered through cities again, taking small jobs that kept him afloat, but each attempt to reshape his life seemed to collide with an obstacle from his past. Still, he maintained the same quiet confidence that had carried him across the ocean years earlier. He believed that every setback, no matter how discouraging, was temporary. Eventually he found himself back in the United States, drifting toward the warmer climate of Georgia. There he encountered a group of Italian immigrants who were struggling without stable work or guidance. Wanting to help, and perhaps craving a purpose, Ponzi joined them in a small business venture meant to support newcomers trying to settle in America. But the plan fell apart when Ponzi discovered that the leader of the group had been using the members' trust to operate a fraudulent service. Although Ponzi hadn't organised the scheme, the authorities considered him involved, and once again he was arrested. Returning to prison a second time was something Ponzi had never imagined for himself. Yet this sentence, like the first, became a strange period of reflection and learning. Surrounded by fellow inmates from many backgrounds, he sharpened his skills even further, studying languages, mathematics, and human behaviour with a dedication that almost surprised him. He never saw prison as the end of his story. He saw it as a pause, a dimly lit interval before the next chapter could unfold. During this time, Ponzi also met several Italian men who had crossed borders illegally. Listening to their stories, he realised how desperation and opportunity often intertwined in unexpected ways. These conversations deepened his understanding of why people make risky choices, and how easily trust could be gained when someone seemed to offer hope. When his sentence ended, Ponzi left with a renewed conviction that he would reinvent himself completely. He travelled back to Boston, a city that had once greeted him with uncertainty, but now felt strangely familiar, almost like a place where redemption might be possible. He took on small jobs again, from translating to clerical work, each one giving him a chance to rebuild step by step. Boston at the time was alive with the movement of people, ideas, and money. Immigrants from Europe filled the neighbourhoods with their languages and ambitions, while businesses competed for attention on busy streets. Ponzi watched it all closely, sensing that the city held something he hadn't yet discovered. What he didn't know was that his life was about to take a turn that would etch his name into history. One ordinary afternoon, while helping a woman with correspondence sent from Europe, Ponzi noticed a small, unfamiliar coupon attached to a letter. It was something he had never paid much attention to before. A postal reply coupon, designed so that someone in one country could prepay for a friend's return postage in another. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, but as Ponzi held the slip of paper between his fingers and examined the fine print, an idea began to form, quiet and subtle, yet powerful enough to reshape the course of his life. That moment, though small and unremarkable to anyone watching, marked the beginning of a chain of thoughts that would soon lead Ponzi down a path toward the scheme that would make him famous, admired, and eventually feared. The postal reply coupon that landed in Charles Ponzi's hands seemed like one of those small bureaucratic tools the world barely noticed. Yet as he studied it, he realized it carried a hidden imbalance that most people overlooked. The coupon allowed someone in a foreign country to prepay for return postage in the recipient's nation, but postal rates fluctuated, and after World War I, those fluctuations had become dramatic. Many European currencies had plummeted, while American postage remained relatively stable. This meant that a coupon bought cheaply in one country could be exchanged for stamps worth significantly more in the United States. Ponzi, who had spent years observing how money moved and how opportunities hid inside ordinary systems, saw an opening. He imagined buying these coupons in countries where inflation had devastated local value, shipping them to America, exchanging them for higher value stamps, selling those stamps, and earning a clean profit. It was a simple form of arbitrage, completely legal in theory, and on paper it looked brilliant. As he sat at his modest desk in Boston, he sketched calculations, tested numbers, and allowed himself to imagine what he had sought for so long. A legitimate path to success, built not on illusion but on clever insight. The more he calculated, the more the idea grew in his mind. He believed he had finally found a way to turn his intelligence and determination into something real, something the world might even respect. But when he attempted to put the idea into practice, he discovered logistical obstacles he hadn't anticipated. Buying and transporting large amounts of coupons across countries wasn't as simple as the arithmetic suggested. The postal system wasn't designed for mass financial exchange, and the volume needed to generate serious profit was enormous. Still, Ponzi refused to abandon the idea. Instead, he shifted his focus. He understood that people didn't invest in ideas. They invested in promises, in confidence, in the feeling that someone had discovered something extraordinary. So he began telling others about his concept, explaining how international postal disparities created a rare opportunity. To many immigrant workers who had lived through war and instability, Ponzi's confidence felt comforting. He spoke with the charm of someone who had been tested by hardship and had finally found something worth believing in. And in early 1920 he founded the Securities Exchange Company, offering investors an astonishing return. 50% profit in 45 days, or even more in 90. He explained that his strategy involved buying coupons abroad and redeeming them in America, turning tiny slips of paper into measurable gains. Most people didn't fully understand the intricacies of postal systems, but they understood the sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his gestures, and the promise of financial relief. Soon, the first investors came forward. Not wealthy businessmen, but ordinary workers hoping to build a better future. Ponzi paid them exactly as promised, not from coupon profits, but from new investors' money. Yet at the time, he didn't see it as wrong. In his mind, the coupon strategy would eventually scale, and the early payouts were simply a bridge towards something that would soon become genuinely self-sustaining. Boston began to buzz with whispers of a man who had cracked a hidden code in the global economy. People lined up outside his office, eager to hand him their savings, convinced they were stepping into the future of smart investing. Ponzi watched the crowds grow day after day and felt something stirring inside him. Part pride, part fear, and part wonder at how quickly fortune could shift. As the crowds outside Charles Ponzi's office grew, the atmosphere around Hanover Street began to shift from quiet curiosity to electric anticipation, creating a kind of daily ritual where people gathered long before the doors opened, hoping to place their money into what seemed like the most reliable opportunity in Boston. Ponzi watched these lines form with a mix of awe and responsibility, feeling a sense of validation he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a drifter or a man searching for purpose. He was someone people trusted, someone whose ideas seemed to offer real hope. The attention quickly spread beyond the immigrant community. Local shopkeepers who had heard whispers joined the lines. Factory workers pooled their savings. Small business owners set aside funds they had once guarded carefully. Even some wealthier individuals, skeptical at first, began to step inside Ponzi's office out of pure curiosity. What they found was a man who radiated calm confidence. His voice was steady, his smile reassuring, and his explanations, though filled with complex references to postal systems and international rates, sounded convincing enough to quiet doubts. Ponzi made a point to greet people personally whenever he could. He listened to their stories, encouraged their dreams, and made each individual feel like an important piece of his growing venture. That warmth became part of the magic. People didn't just invest because of the promised returns, they invested because Ponzi made them feel seen. Inside the office, workers counted money almost non-stop. Ledgers filled with names and numbers, and the sound of footsteps echoed across the floor as clerks moved between investors and back rooms. Outside, the street felt like a festival, buzzing with excitement and conversations about quick profits. Yet behind the scenes, the financial structure of Ponzi's operation was beginning to take on a shape he hadn't entirely intended. The amount of money flowing in each day was far beyond what he had imagined, and the coupon strategy, his original plan, was nearly impossible to scale to match the volume. The postal system simply couldn't support the quantity of coupons required to match the growing promises. Still, Ponzi didn't panic. He told himself the imbalance would sort itself out eventually. He believed that with enough time and enough reinvested returns, he would find a way to convert the theory into a fully functioning reality. When early investors returned for their payouts, Ponzi greeted them with envelopes filled with cash, smiling as he handed over the money. Some were so thrilled that they immediately reinvested, bringing friends and relatives on their next visit. Word spread quickly. Newspapers began noticing the phenomenon, though at first their tone was neutral, focusing on the human interest side of the story. Reporters described Ponzi as a man with a brilliant mind and an unusual business model, someone who had discovered something the rest of Boston had overlooked. As lines wrapped around the block, Ponzi began upgrading his lifestyle, not out of vanity but from a long-standing desire to finally live like someone who had succeeded. He bought a larger home, wore neatly tailored suits, and purchased a few luxuries that made him feel grounded in his new identity. Yet deep down, a quiet awareness lingered, an understanding that the gap between his promises and his reality was widening. Each morning when he stepped into his office, he felt both the thrill of growth and the weight of responsibility pressing against him. He wanted to believe he could still bridge the distance between the dream he sold and the mechanics needed to sustain it. In those early summer months of 1920, however, almost no one in Boston questioned him. To many, Ponzi seemed like a rare gift in uncertain times, a man who had cracked a code others couldn't see. And as long as the returns kept flowing, few dared to imagine that anything beneath the surface might eventually unravel. As summer settled over Boston in 1920, Charles Ponzi found himself at the centre of a growing financial storm, one he had created without fully realizing how immense it had become. Every morning, when he approached his office, he saw crowds stretching farther down the street than the day before. People waved at him, called his name, and greeted him like a figure of prosperity. Some brought homemade food as a gesture of gratitude. Others held envelopes filled with savings they trusted him with completely. The energy around the securities exchange company felt almost unreal, a mixture of hope, excitement, and belief that Ponzi was doing something extraordinary. Inside, clerks hurried through long tables stacked with paperwork, stamping receipts and counting bills as fast as their hands could move. Ponzi's office grew so busy that additional rooms had to be rented, and even then the constant hum of activity made the space feel too small. To maintain order, Ponzi hired more employees, adding layers of structure to an operation that had grown far beyond its original design. Despite the momentum, Ponzi knew the underlying mechanics were fragile. He still believed his coupon idea had potential, but scaling it to match investor demand had proven nearly impossible. Yet each time he considered slowing the flow of new investors or adjusting the promised returns, he convinced himself that doing so would damage public confidence. He had become, in his own mind, a guardian of hope, and pulling back felt like breaking an unspoken promise. Newspapers continued writing about him, shifting from curiosity to admiration. They described him as an immigrant success story, a man who had risen from nothing and discovered a financial opportunity overlooked by experts. His name appeared in headlines next to glowing phrases like financial wizard and modern miracle. The praise bolstered public enthusiasm, and by July, tens of thousands of dollars were flowing into his office every day. Ponzi, wanting to maintain a respectable image, purchased a spacious home in the suburb of Lexington. It was a place with a wide porch, polished floors, and room enough to reflect the comfortable life he had always imagined. He also bought a fine car, enjoyed dinners in elegant restaurants, and dressed in sharp suits that fit him with precision. But despite these new luxuries, he remained warm and approachable. He still greeted investors personally whenever possible, insisting that kindness and sincerity were part of why people trusted him. Meanwhile, the postal authorities had quietly begun noticing unusual inquiries about international reply coupons. Though not yet concerned, they wondered why someone would need such large quantities. What they didn't realise was that Ponzi wasn't actually acquiring huge amounts at all. The system simply couldn't handle the volume required to support the investment scale he had built. Instead, the engine driving his company had become the constant flow of new money, something Ponzi acknowledged only in the quietest corners of his thoughts. Still, he believed he could fix everything. He told himself that with enough time, he would eventually bridge the gap between the original idea and the operational reality. He imagined setting up international branches, negotiating with postal authorities, and turning the coupon plan into the legitimate enterprise he had first envisioned. If he could reach that point, all the interim juggling would be forgiven. But a new challenge was beginning to rise, one not fueled by doubt, but by curiosity. Reporters who once praised him began asking sharper questions. Competitors who had dismissed him as an anomaly now felt threatened. Financial experts wondered how he maintained such remarkable returns. And in the background, the federal government had quietly begun watching, trying to understand how Charles Ponzi was accomplishing what no one else could. The spotlight that once felt warm was slowly becoming brighter, and with that brightness came the risk of revealing more than Ponzi intended. By midsummer of 1920, the admiration surrounding Charles Ponzi had begun attracting a different kind of attention, one rooted not in excitement, but in professional skepticism. Among those watching was Richard Grozier, the young acting publisher of the Boston Post, a newspaper known for its investigative instincts. At first, Grozier had allowed the glowing articles about Ponzi to run without interference, but as the lines outside Ponzi's office grew longer, and the promised returns remained astonishingly high, he started to feel uneasy. Something about the numbers seemed too perfect, too consistent, too insulated from the real-world fluctuations that financial ventures typically faced. He couldn't shake the suspicion that the story was incomplete. Inside the newsroom, conversations about Ponzi became frequent. Some reporters believed Ponzi had genuinely discovered a unique international opportunity. Others argued that the math simply didn't add up, that no one could turn postal coupons into such enormous profits without logistical impossibilities. The more Grozier listened, the more he felt responsible for digging deeper. After all, if Ponzi was legitimate, then a newspaper investigation would only confirm his brilliance. But if something was wrong, then the public deserved clarity. Grozier assigned a skeptical reporter named Clarence Barron to look into Ponzi's background. Barron was known for his persistence and for being unimpressed by charm or spectacle. He began by studying the postal coupon system and quickly realized that the number of coupons required to support Ponzi's claims would be astronomical, far greater than the entire amount in circulation worldwide. Even at maximum theoretical efficiency, the system couldn't sustain the returns Ponzi promised. Barron also learned that Ponzi's personal history was more complicated than his public image suggested. His past arrests, his time in Canadian prison, and his involvement with questionable individuals all resurfaced quietly, as Barron pieced together information from various sources. Meanwhile, Ponzi himself remained calm on the surface. He continued greeting investors, managing the daily operations and projecting confidence. But he sensed a shift in the air. The questions from reporters had become more pointed, and the tone of interviews suggested that the public narrative might soon change. Still, Ponzi believed he could handle whatever came his way. He felt that as long as he maintained payouts and kept public trust intact, skepticism would fade. He reminded himself that great innovators throughout history had faced criticism before being understood. He saw himself as someone who had simply discovered a gap in a system, a gap others couldn't comprehend yet. As Barron continued his investigation, the Boston Post reached out to bankers, accountants, and economists. Most expressed doubt about the feasibility of Ponzi's operations. They mentioned the postal system's limitations, the scarcity of coupons, and the lack of a visible infrastructure to support international arbitrage at such a scale. The more experts Barron consulted, the clearer the pattern became. No one believed the math worked. While all this unfolded, Ponzi enjoyed the height of his public fame. People stopped him on the streets to shake his hand. Investors thanked him for helping them achieve financial stability. Some even called him a hero for immigrants, a symbol of what was possible through determination and intelligence. Yet inside his Lexington home, during moments of quiet reflection, Ponzi felt a small, persistent tension forming. He knew the investigation could turn public sentiment against him if it gained momentum, but he told himself that the truth, his version of it, would prevail. He still envisioned a future where he would legitimize his operations, present undeniable evidence of his brilliance, and silence all doubts. What he didn't realize was that the newspaper's curiosity was about to ignite the chain of events that would unravel everything he had built, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the truth he had tried so hard to outrun. As the Boston Post intensified its investigation, Charles Ponzi found himself living in two different worlds at once. The public world, where he was still celebrated as a financial visionary, and the private one, where questions were beginning to gather like slow-moving clouds. Each morning, when he stepped outside his Lexington home, neighbours waved warmly, unaware of the quiet tension building behind the scenes. The combination of admiration and uncertainty created a peculiar atmosphere around him, one where success and suspicion intertwined in ways he could no longer fully separate. Inside his office on Hanover Street, the lines of investors continued to stretch around the block, but Ponzi noticed that some people no longer looked at him with pure excitement. Their expressions carried a hint of curiosity, even concern, shaped by whispers spreading through the city. A few had read the first skeptical articles published by the Boston Post, which questioned the viability of Ponzi's coupon strategy. Still, most investors brushed off the questions. They trusted their own experience more than newspaper speculation. Ponzi had paid them on time, every time, and in their eyes, that proof outweighed any calculations printed in a column. Yet the newspaper's questions did not stop. Clarence Barron, now fully committed to uncovering the truth, continued digging. He discovered that Ponzi wasn't buying postal reply coupons in any significant quantity. In fact, the total number of coupons available worldwide was nowhere near enough to support the profits Ponzi claimed. Barron also visited Ponzi's bank and calculated that, for Ponzi to pay all his obligations, he would need far more funds than he possessed. These findings began to leak into the public conversation. Still, Ponzi remained outwardly composed. He invited reporters into his office, answered their questions, and assured them that his business was sound. His composure amazed even those who doubted him, making them wonder whether there was more to the story than they understood. Behind closed doors, however, Ponzi felt the pressure tightening. He reviewed his ledgers late at night, searching for a path that would allow him to stabilize the operation. He reassured himself repeatedly that everything could still be fixed. He believed that if he could just buy enough time, things would eventually align with his original vision. Meanwhile, state and federal authorities began taking interest. The sheer volume of money flowing through Ponzi's company raised eyebrows at the district attorney's office and the US Postal Inspection Service. They weren't sure whether Ponzi was breaking any laws, but the unusual promises of enormous returns made the operation worth examining. inspectors quietly gathered information, reviewing bank accounts, tax records, and correspondence in hopes of discovering how Ponzi's business actually worked. When Ponzi learned of these inquiries, he tried to stay calm. He assured his employees that everything was fine, that his success had simply drawn attention, and that investigations were normal for anyone handling such large sums of money. But part of him understood the danger. Investigators would not rely on charm or optimism. They would analyse numbers, track evidence, and uncover the exact mechanics of his operation. And once they did, they would see the truth he had been avoiding. The coupon strategy was no longer sustaining anything. The operation lived entirely on the momentum of new investments. Even as he tried to push the thought aside, Ponzi sensed that the window of time he needed to somehow turn the dream into a functioning reality was narrowing quickly. The applause outside his office still echoed, but now it blended with a faint undercurrent of doubt, a sound that hinted at the coming shift in the city's mood. As July 1920 unfolded, the tension surrounding Charles Ponzi's enterprise expanded quietly, almost invisibly at first, like a thread being pulled from the edge of a tightly woven fabric. Most investors still believed in him wholeheartedly, but the growing number of questions from reporters, bankers, and government officials brought an unease that even Ponzi couldn't ignore. At his office, he continued projecting calm confidence, yet whenever he stepped into a quieter room, his thoughts drifted toward the cracks beginning to appear in his carefully constructed world. The first major blow came when the Boston Post published a detailed expose questioning the mathematics of Ponzi's operation. The article explained that the number of postal reply coupons needed to support the promised returns wasn't simply large, it was impossible. According to the paper, Ponzi would have needed a logistical network larger than some national postal systems just to manage the volume required for his business model. The news spread quickly. Some people arrived at Ponzi's office clutching newspapers, asking for reassurance. Others dismissed the article outright, assuming it was written out of jealousy or misunderstanding. Many investors even reinvested their money in defiance of the skepticism, claiming they trusted Ponzi more than any reporter. Still, the tone in the city shifted. Conversations about Ponzi no longer revolved solely around admiration. Now people debated whether a man could truly generate such extraordinary returns without an unseen method or hidden risk. Banks began refusing to work with his company, worried about potential scandals. Even some of Ponzi's employees sensed a change and exchanged uncertain glances as they processed the endless flow of deposits. When Ponzi read the article himself, he felt a flicker of anger, followed by a wave of determination. He refused to let doubt undermine everything he had built. He contacted lawyers, planned public statements, and prepared to confront the accusations head-on. In his mind, transparency and a confident appearance would be enough to silence the critics, at least for a while. But behind the defiance, he felt the strain of maintaining an operation that had grown far beyond what he could control. More investigators began arriving in Boston, some openly, others discreetly gathering information. The Massachusetts Bank Commissioner's Office reviewed Ponzi's finances and noted discrepancies between his obligations and his available funds. The inquiries were not yet accusations, but they signalled an approaching storm. Ponzi tried to maintain his routine. He continued greeting investors and writing checks, wanting to preserve the image of stability. He believed that as long as payouts continued, confidence would hold, and for the moment, it worked. People lined up as they always had, though now their conversations contained streaks of concern. The office felt filled with a strange dual current, fear flowing quietly beneath optimism. Yet despite everything, Ponzi still clung to hope. He imagined solutions he might implement if given just a little more time. He thought about renegotiating interest terms, launching new ventures, or finally finding a logistical breakthrough for the coupon strategy. He reassured himself that redemption was still possible. But gradually the investigations were converging, narrowing around him like the closing of a circle. Each day added more documents, more interviews, more scrutiny. And while investors continued arriving with envelopes of cash, Ponzi could feel the balance shifting. The applause that once energized him was beginning to sound distant, drowned out by the steady approach of forces he could no longer charm away. By late July 1920, the widening investigations around Charles Ponzi began creating a sense of urgency that lingered in every room he entered, even though outwardly he maintained the same calm posture that had reassured investors for months. His office hummed with activity as clerks counted cash and processed endless transactions, but beneath the busy rhythm was a growing tension, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The questions raised by the Boston Post had unsettled the financial community, prompting the Massachusetts Bank Commissioner Daniel Gallagher to examine Ponzi's records more closely. Gallagher, meticulous and methodical in his work, reviewed statements, bank balances, and investor contracts, searching for inconsistencies. What he found concerned him. Ponzi's liabilities, what he owed to investors, were drastically larger than the assets he held. The math wasn't subtle. It pointed toward an imbalance that could not be corrected through legitimate means. Gallagher requested a full audit, though he knew Ponzi could delay it by refusing access. At the same time, the US Postal Inspection Service heightened its inquiries. Investigators analysed the global supply of postal reply coupons and compared it to the quantities Ponzi would need. Their conclusion echoed what reporters had already suggested. The entire world's coupon inventory couldn't support even a fraction of the operation Ponzi claimed to be running. Meanwhile, Ponzi's investors remained largely loyal. Many were immigrants who admired him deeply and believed he represented hope in a world still recovering from war and instability. They stood firmly beside him, arguing that numbers on paper could never outweigh the proof they had experienced firsthand: timely payouts, friendly conversations, and the sense that Ponzi saw them not as accounts, but as people. Yet Ponzi himself felt pressure intensifying. Each day brought new letters from officials requesting documents, new questions from reporters, and new hints of legal scrutiny. At night, sitting alone in his Lexington home, he replayed the events that had brought him here. He didn't see himself as a villain. In his mind, he had tried to build something revolutionary, something that could have worked if given the chance to mature. He told himself that the investigators were simply too rigid to understand innovation, too bound by conventional thinking to recognize a bold new idea. Despite this self-reassurance, he took steps to protect his public image. He hired additional lawyers, practiced statements he might give to reporters, and discussed strategies with his office managers to maintain investor confidence. On some days, he even stood outside his office to greet the crowds personally, letting his presence act as a shield against rising doubts. But the investigations were gaining momentum. Bank officials worried that a collapse could destabilize local financial institutions. Politicians feared public outrage if the situation turned out to be fraudulent. Journalists sensed a major story growing larger by the day, and though Ponzi continued to function with outward poise, he felt the walls closing in. The balance he had prolonged through charm and timing was becoming harder to maintain. Still, he believed he could fix everything if he only had more time. Time to reshape the business, time to stabilize the payouts, time to transform an unsustainable structure into the legitimate enterprise he had once dreamed of. Yet the forces gathering around him were not slowing. They were preparing for the moment when questions would become demands, and demands would become consequences. As August 1920 approached, the quiet pressure surrounding Charles Ponzi took on a sharper, more tangible form when the Massachusetts Bank Commissioner intensified his push for a full audit of Ponzi's books. Ponzi knew that allowing auditors unrestricted access would expose the growing gap between what he owed and what he actually had, so he stalled, citing logistical issues, busy schedules, and the need to organize documents properly. These delays bought him time, but not much. The Commissioner's office, sensing resistance, became even more determined to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, the Boston Post continued publishing articles that questioned Ponzi's legitimacy. Some pieces focused on the mathematical impossibility of his returns. Others probed his personal history, including his time in Canadian prison, details most investors had never heard. The articles stirred public curiosity, but surprisingly they did not trigger panic. Many supporters believed the newspaper was trying to sabotage Ponzi's success. Some even wrote letters to the editor defending him, insisting that a man who had made so many ordinary people wealthy could not possibly be dishonest. This loyalty comforted Ponzi, though it also deepened his awareness that disappointment, if it ever came, would devastate countless families. At his office, the flow of money continued, though now accompanied by more questions. A few investors asked about the newspaper stories, but Ponzi reassured them with smooth explanations. He insisted that the coupon strategy was sound, and that the scrutiny was simply the natural attention that came with success. His ability to project confidence was so strong that even those who walked in with doubts often left feeling reassured. Yet internally, Ponzi felt the weight of every question. The investigations were no longer distant threats. They were at his doorstep. His lawyers warned him that the authorities were coordinating efforts, sharing documents, and pooling information to understand the workings of his company. Even small inconsistencies in his story were being catalogued. During these tense days, Ponzi made a bold decision to fight back publicly. He held short press interactions, emphasizing his willingness to cooperate with investigators and portraying himself as a victim of envy and misunderstanding. He talked about his humble beginnings, his desire to help immigrants succeed, and his commitment to paying everyone exactly what he had promised. These statements temporarily eased concerns, especially among those who admired his charisma. But one obstacle remained: the mandatory audit. Commissioner Gallagher insisted on examining Ponzi's primary bank, Hanover Trust, which handled most of the funds moving through the Securities Exchange Company. If Gallagher gained access, the true state of Ponzi's finances would be undeniable. Knowing this, Ponzi tried a different approach. He attempted to acquire control of the bank itself. If he could own Hanover Trust, he believed he could prevent investigators from examining the accounts too closely. He began purchasing shares quietly, spreading purchases among different intermediaries to avoid raising suspicion. For a moment, it seemed like this plan might work. Ponzi inched toward gaining influence over the bank, envisioning himself securing enough control to delay or block regulators. But time was working against him. The Commissioner's office was already preparing legal steps to obtain the records by force if necessary. And behind all of this, postal inspectors, federal agents, and financial analysts were coordinating their findings, slowly painting a clearer picture of a system that depended entirely on constant new investments. As Ponzi continued juggling public reassurance and private strategy, he sensed something shifting in the city, a subtle change in tone, as if Boston were collectively holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would finally be revealed. In the first days of August 1920, the fragile balance Charles Ponzi had been maintaining began to tilt more noticeably as state and federal scrutiny intensified, each department pushing a little harder, asking for documents Ponzi could no longer delay providing. Commissioner Gallagher, no longer patient with excuses, issued a formal demand for access to Ponzi's bank accounts at Hanover Trust. Ponzi's attempt to quietly buy control of the bank had stalled just short of success, leaving him vulnerable. He knew that once investigators examined the accounts, the truth, that his obligations far exceeded his resources, would be impossible to hide. This looming certainty created a tension he carried with him into every decision, every interaction, even as he tried to appear calm. Despite the pressure, investors still arrived in long lines, some clutching savings gathered over decades. Many refused to believe the growing skepticism in newspapers. In their eyes, Ponzi remained the immigrant hero who had delivered prosperity when no one else could. Their unwavering trust gave Ponzi both comfort and unease. He felt grateful yet burdened, aware that every additional dollar taken in deepened the distance between the illusion he had built and the truth waiting beneath it. Meanwhile, the Boston Post published yet another investigative piece that further shifted public conversation. This time, the paper highlighted expert testimony from economists who emphasized the impossibility of Ponzi's coupon arbitrage at scale. The article included detailed calculations showing that even if Ponzi had somehow cornered the entire world's supply of reply coupons, the profits would still fall wildly short of what he was paying investors. The story also questioned why no one had ever seen the supposed warehouses or international operations needed to support such a system. These revelations unsettled some investors. A few arrived at Ponzi's office asking to withdraw their funds immediately. Ponzi paid them without hesitation, hoping to demonstrate reliability. Ironically, these payouts convinced many others to reinvest, strengthening their belief that Ponzi's operation was secure. Yet each payout tightened the pressure on Ponzi's already strained finances. Privately, he reviewed his ledgers late into the night, trying to find a way out. He considered reducing the promised returns, but he knew that even a slight change could shatter confidence instantly. He imagined launching a new venture, one with real operations, hoping he could transition money into something legitimate before the investigations uncovered too much. But time was slipping away. Gallagher, determined not to be outmaneuvered, prepared a legal strategy to seize records if Ponzi continued delaying. Postal inspectors compiled documents, noting inconsistencies between Ponzi's statements and the limited circulation of coupons worldwide. And federal agents, sensing the possibility of mail fraud, quietly gathered evidence that could escalate the investigation into a criminal case. Ponzi felt the pressure closing in from all directions, yet he continued presenting himself as composed and unshaken. He reassured employees, shook hands with investors, and attempted to slow the growing sense of doubt. But in the rare moments he stood alone, he sensed that the structure he'd built, once held together by confidence and timing, was beginning to tremble. The city around him had not yet turned against him, but the first signs of a shift were visible. Quieter conversations, longer pauses, and a subtle tension that hinted at the coming unravelling. Ponzi still believed he could regain control, but the window for doing so was shrinking rapidly. As the second week of August 1920 opened, the quiet tension that had hovered around Charles Ponzi's world began shifting into something heavier, something that even the most loyal investors could sense. While people still lined up outside his office, the mood had changed. The smiles were thinner, the conversations quieter, and more than a few investors clutched folded newspapers containing the latest articles from the Boston Post. Each day brought new reports outlining inconsistencies in Ponzi's business model, and although many still defended him, the growing weight of public scrutiny was beginning to erode the unquestioning faith that had once surrounded his name. Commissioner Gallagher, now fully convinced that something was gravely wrong, moved forward with legal action to access Ponzi's accounts at Hanover Trust. Ponzi could no longer delay the process. When investigators finally reviewed the bank's records, they discovered that the company's financial health was dire. Ponzi owed millions to investors, but held only a fraction of that amount in liquid assets. These findings were kept quiet initially, but they reinforced Gallagher's determination to act quickly before the situation escalated further. Meanwhile, postal inspectors completed their own analysis, confirming that Ponzi's coupon strategy was not only unscalable, but practically non-existent. They found that fewer than 50,000 reply coupons were in circulation globally, far too few to support the returns Ponzi promised. The inspectors concluded that Ponzi's operation depended entirely on new investor money, a realization that pointed clearly toward fraud. But while investigators and officials raced to piece together the truth, Ponzi still attempted to maintain normalcy. He greeted investors warmly, reassured employees that everything was under control, and made public statements defending his integrity. His charisma remained powerful, enough to convince many that he was the victim of an unjust campaign designed to tear down a successful immigrant. Inside, however, he felt the reality closing in. He reviewed the numbers repeatedly, searching for any path that might allow him to stabilize the business, even briefly. He considered selling assets, renegotiating contracts, or launching new ventures, but each option felt increasingly unrealistic. At the same time, his lawyers warned him that investigators were gathering overwhelming evidence. They advised him to prepare for the possibility of legal consequences, though Ponzi found it difficult to accept that the empire he had built so quickly could unravel just as fast. The breaking point came when the Boston Post, sensing the story reaching critical mass, published a front-page investigation questioning whether Ponzi was insolvent. This article spread through Boston with remarkable speed, reaching homes, offices, and banks within hours. Investors arrived at Ponzi's office in waves, some demanding their money back, others asking whether the rumours were true. Ponzi paid out withdrawals as he always had, hoping to calm the situation, but the requests grew faster than the funds he could access. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the office felt significantly different. The once celebratory lines had transformed into restless queues filled with uncertainty. Employees whispered among themselves, unsure how much longer the company could function. And Ponzi, despite still wearing an air of confidence, felt a quiet shift inside him, a recognition that the structure he'd built was no longer steady. Even as he tried to suppress the thought, he sensed that the unravelling had already begun, and stopping it might no longer be possible. As mid-August 1920 approached, the fragile confidence surrounding Charles Ponzi's operation continued slipping, replaced by a rising sense of urgency that filled every corner of his office. The lines outside were still long, but they no longer carried the hopeful energy that had once defined them. Instead, they moved with a tense, restless impatience. People clutched newspaper clippings, whispered rumours to one another, and stepped inside with the quiet desperation of those who feared they might lose everything. Inside the Securities Exchange Company, employees worked at a frantic pace, counting withdrawals, taking calls, and doing their best to soothe anxious investors. Ponzi himself spent much of the day meeting people face to face, trying to maintain an image of calm authority. He offered the same reassuring smile he always had, insisting that the rumours would pass and that the business was fundamentally sound. Many wanted desperately to believe him, but the growing weight of doubt was becoming harder to ignore. The situation worsened when the state banking commissioner revealed preliminary findings to the press, hinting at a dangerous imbalance between Ponzi's obligations and his available funds. Though these statements were carefully phrased, they were enough to intensify public panic. Investors began withdrawing money faster than Ponzi could replace it, and each withdrawal drained the limited cash reserves he still controlled. Despite the chaos, Ponzi tried to project confidence. He returned to Hanover Trust and attempted to reassure bank officials, insisting that the business was solvent and that the panic was temporary. He hoped to secure additional loans or delay certain payments, but the bank, now under pressure from regulators, refused to extend further credit. Without access to those funds, Ponzi's ability to meet investor demand weakened dramatically. Meanwhile, federal authorities continued tightening their investigation. Postal inspectors shared evidence with the U.S. Attorney's Office, pointing out that the volume of reply coupons Ponzi claimed to be trading was impossible. The story they were building, one of deception hidden beneath charisma, was now nearly unavoidable. In his Lexington home, Ponzi's wife Rose felt the strain as well. She remained supportive, believing in her husband's sincerity and ambition, but she could not ignore the sudden shift in their household. Phone calls grew constant, visitors arrived at unusual hours, and Ponzi spent long nights pacing through rooms, thinking through calculations and strategies that no longer offered real solutions. Even so, Ponzi remained determined. He believed he could still stabilize the situation if given enough time, and he planned a public statement that he hoped would restore confidence. But before he could deliver it, the Boston Post released yet another front-page story, this one describing Ponzi's previous conviction in Canada. For many investors, especially those who had admired him as a symbol of integrity and immigrant success, This revelation struck at the heart of their trust. By the following morning, the line outside his office had shifted again. It still stretched around the block, but the people waiting were no longer hopeful investors. They were nervous depositors demanding their money back. And for the first time, Ponzi knew that his reassurances might no longer be enough. The tide of belief that had carried him to fame was turning, and he could feel the momentum slipping through his fingers. On the morning of August 12, 1920, the atmosphere outside Charles Ponzi's office felt dramatically different from anything the city had seen in the previous months. Instead of a hopeful chatter or excited whispers, a heavy silence stretched down Hanover Street as hundreds waited anxiously for the doors to open. Many held newspapers folded under their arms, fresh with headlines about Ponzi's past conviction in Canada. Others clutched withdrawal forms, their faces tense with worry. The belief that had once defined the crowd had now shifted into fear. Inside the office, employees sensed the change immediately. The usual rhythm of counting deposits had been replaced with a rapid, unending stream of withdrawal requests. Clerks worked quickly, trying to keep pace, but the flow of cash leaving the building had begun to outstrip what the company could provide. Ponzi, after stepping through the rear entrance to avoid the growing crowd, went straight to his desk, reviewing the few financial options he still had. He knew the situation was becoming unsustainable, yet he continued telling himself he could manage one more day, one more shift in momentum, one more opportunity to restore stability. Reporters started gathering outside as well, waiting for a sign of what would happen next. Some attempted to speak with investors in line, gathering quotes that painted a picture of fear mixed with lingering hope. A few people still defended Ponzi passionately, insisting that the negative press was part of a conspiracy, but most spoke with the uncertainty of those who felt the ground shifting beneath them. As the morning stretched on, state officials arrived at Hanover Trust to protect what remained of Ponzi's deposits. The bank, now under direct scrutiny, froze Ponzi's accounts to prevent further depletion of funds. This move, though technically cautious, had immediate consequences. Without access to the bank's reserves, Ponzi could no longer process the withdrawals piling up at his office. When word reached the crowd that payouts had slowed, the tension broke into audible frustration. People pressed closer to the doors, demanding answers. Ponzi stepped out briefly to address them, raising his hands in a gesture of reassurance. He insisted that the situation was temporary, that the bank was cooperating, and that everyone would be paid. His voice was steady, but inside he knew the reality was slipping beyond his control. Throughout the afternoon, regulators circulated inside the office, examining records, observing transactions, and quietly documenting their findings. They avoided direct confrontation, but their presence signaled that action was imminent. Ponzi attempted to meet privately with his attorneys, hoping they could negotiate with the commission, or buy him enough time to regroup. But every conversation ended the same way. The legal ground beneath him was disappearing. Later that day, the bank commissioner issued an order officially placing Ponzi's company under state supervision. This decision, reached after hours of quiet analysis, marked the first step towards shutting down the operation entirely. When Ponzi received the notice, he sat alone in his office for several minutes, absorbing the weight of the moment. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, unaware that events had already shifted beyond his reach. Evening crept over Boston with an unusual stillness. Investors returned home uncertain, employees whispered among themselves, and regulators prepared for the next phase of action. And Ponzi, though still determined to maintain a brave face, felt something he had avoided acknowledging for months. A recognition that the empire built on confidence was nearing its breaking point. The morning after state supervision was imposed on his company, Charles Ponzi woke with a feeling he had not experienced in years, a heavy, unavoidable stillness that settled deep in his chest. For months he had moved forward by relying on momentum, charm, and confidence. But now the energy that once propelled him felt distant, disrupted by forces he could no longer push aside. As he prepared to leave his Lexington home, He could already imagine the scene awaiting him on Hanover Street. When he arrived, the crowd outside his office was larger and more restless than the day before. Many investors had brought family members, hoping that together they might find answers or secure their savings before it was too late. Some people shouted questions as Ponzi stepped through the doors, but he kept his expression calm, determined not to let panic influence the atmosphere inside. Behind closed doors, however, the situation had clearly deteriorated. Regulators now had full access to the company's records, and accountants were reviewing ledgers with increasing alarm. They asked for explanations about numbers that didn't align, transactions that had no documentation, and cash reserves that had nearly vanished. Every question pushed Ponzi deeper into a corner, yet he continued insisting that missing details could be clarified, that the chaos was temporary, and that the business would stabilize once the investigations ended. Meanwhile, the Boston Post released another headline that intensified the crisis, an in-depth analysis of Ponzi's financial structure, explaining in plain terms that his obligations exceeded his assets by millions. This story spread rapidly throughout Boston, and within hours the uncertainty surrounding Ponzi transformed into open fear. Investors crowded closer to the office, demanding information, some pleading, others angry. Officers were eventually called to manage the growing unrest. Despite the mounting pressure, Ponzi attempted one final strategy to regain control. He offered full cooperation with a federal audit, hoping it would restore public confidence. But the gesture came too late. The US Attorney's Office, now fully engaged, had already begun drafting charges based on evidence collected by postal inspectors and bank examiners. In private meetings, officials agreed that Ponzi's scheme was one of the largest financial deceptions ever witnessed in the region. They prepared to move forward as soon as the final reports were complete. Inside the office, employees sensed the inevitable. Many worked quietly, avoiding eye contact, unsure whether they would have jobs by the end of the week. A few asked Ponzi directly whether they should expect closure, but he offered only vague reassurances, unable to admit the truth even to those who had stood beside him since the early days. That afternoon, Ponzi walked through the rooms slowly, taking in the sight of desks stacked with papers, the sound of telephones ringing endlessly, and the anxious whispers between clerks. Just weeks earlier, this place had been filled with excitement and promise. Now it felt like the fading echo of a dream that had collapsed under its own weight. As he stood by the window overlooking the street, watching the restless crowd shift beneath the summer sun, Ponzi felt a quiet clarity settle in. He understood that his time was running out, that the optimism he had relied on for so long could no longer hold back the consequences. And although he continued to hope for a last-minute miracle, deep down he sensed that the next days would bring decisions he could no longer influence or delay. By August 13th, 1920, the machinery of investigation surrounding Charles Ponzi had accelerated to a pace he could no longer match. Regulators, accountants, postal inspectors, and federal agents moved steadily through his records, piecing together the scope of his obligations. Their findings, though not yet public, pointed in the same direction: insolvency on a scale far larger than anyone had anticipated. Ponzi arrived at his office early that morning, carrying the familiar determination that had sustained him through countless challenges, but even he sensed how dramatically the atmosphere had shifted. The crowd outside was restless and louder than the day before. Many shouted angrily as he walked inside, demanding answers, demanding money, demanding honesty. Others simply stared, as if trying to understand how a man they had once trusted so deeply could be at the centre of such turbulence. Once inside, Ponzi was met with updates he had dreaded. The state-appointed accountants, after reviewing another portion of the books, concluded that Ponzi's total liabilities approached $7 million, far more than the office held in cash or assets. They noted the absence of postal coupon purchases, the lack of documented transactions, and the overwhelming reliance on new investments to cover earlier payouts. These findings, soon to be forwarded to federal prosecutors, eliminated any remaining optimism regulators had. Meanwhile, the Boston Post prepared to release yet another article, this one detailing statements from experts who compared Ponzi's structure to financial collapses that had occurred in Europe decades earlier. The article framed Ponzi not as a misunderstood genius, but as a man whose operation carried the unmistakable pattern of a pyramid built on fragile trust. As word of the upcoming story spread, the pressure outside the office intensified. Investors pushed toward the entrance, hoping to withdraw money before the anticipated collapse. Police officers were dispatched to control the situation, forming a barrier between the office and the crowd. Ponzi watched from the window, aware that the faith once granted so freely had transformed into fear and anger. Despite everything, he still tried to maintain dignity. He wrote checks for as long as funds allowed, reassured those who came inside, and insisted to his staff that his cooperation with authorities would soon restore calm. But the checks he signed were now limited, each one drawing from reserves that had dwindled to almost nothing. His managers informed him repeatedly that the company could not continue in this state, but Ponzi waved them off, asking for more time, more patience, more faith. In the early afternoon, he received a summons from the state authorities. He was ordered to appear for an official hearing regarding his company's financial condition. The document made it clear that regulators intended to take full control unless he could provide proof of solvency. Ponzi read the notice silently, then folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. He knew he didn't have the answers they wanted, yet a part of him still believed he might talk his way through the crisis, that his charm could buy him a few more days. But when he stepped into the main office again, he saw his employees watching him with worried eyes. Some whispered among themselves, others stood motionless, unsure whether to continue working. The certainty that had once filled the room had vanished. As evening settled over Boston, the crowd outside remained, unwilling to leave without answers. Ponzi lingered at his desk long after most employees had left, staring at the final pages of his ledgers. The numbers, once symbols of possibility, now felt like cold reminders of a dream slipping out of reach. And though he still clung to a quiet hope, he sensed with growing clarity that the moment he had tried so hard to delay was drawing near. On August 14th, 1920, the slow unravelling of Charles Ponzi's financial empire entered its decisive phase. Overnight, news of the state's findings had begun circulating informally through banker networks and local officials, and by morning, whispers of insolvency had reached the broader public. When Ponzi arrived at his office, the crowd waiting for him had doubled in size. Some faces were familiar, long-time supporters who had invested early and reinvested faithfully, while others were new, people who had come only to demand their money back before the situation worsened. The tension was intense enough that police officers stood along the sidewalks to maintain order. Inside the office, Ponzi tried to maintain composure. He reassured his remaining staff, though he noticed several empty desks. Some employees had quietly resigned, unwilling to face what now seemed inevitable. Those who stayed worked nervously, processing the few withdrawals that Ponzi could still honour. Meanwhile, state auditors continued moving through the ledgers, completing their review with increasing speed. Their final notes painted a clear picture. The company's liabilities were staggering, and the available cash was almost non-existent. Each section of the financial report strengthened the conclusion that Ponzi's business model could not possibly deliver the returns he promised. By midday, officials from the district attorney's office arrived, requesting additional documents and hinting that criminal charges might soon follow. They asked Ponzi directly whether he could provide evidence of coupon purchases, shipping records, or international operations. Ponzi responded calmly, insisting that paperwork was still being organised, that the chaos of recent days had delayed everything. His explanations, once persuasive, now sounded thin even to those who admired him. Outside, the crowd grew restless. A few investors tried pushing toward the entrance, shouting that Ponzi owed them their life savings. Others begged for answers, asking whether the newspaper stories were true. The mixture of fear and anger created an uneasy pulse that echoed through the building. When Ponzi stepped out briefly to address them, his voice carried the same smooth confidence, but his words no longer soothed the crowd. Too much doubt had seeped in. In the afternoon, Ponzi met with his lawyers, who warned him that the federal government was preparing to seize control of his company. The postal inspector's report, they explained, left little room for interpretation. It proved beyond question that Ponzi had engaged in mail-related deception by promising profits he could never realistically generate. This meant federal charges, serious ones, were imminent. Ponzi listened quietly, tapping his fingers against the desk, trying to absorb the reality unfolding around him. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that there might be no path out. Still, a part of him resisted the truth. He had built his life on improbable belief that he could rebound from prison, reinvent himself, and create something extraordinary. Surrendering to the collapse felt like surrendering to the idea that everything he had imagined for himself had been nothing more than illusion. Evening approached with a heavy calm. Many investors lingered outside long after the office closed, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Inside, Ponzi stood alone for several minutes before finally gathering his papers and leaving through the back door. The city lights reflected off the streets as he walked to his car, and for a brief moment he paused, letting the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. The investigations were tightening, the public was turning, and the final reckoning was now only days, perhaps hours, away. On August 15th, 1920, the turning point arrived with a quiet inevitability that even Charles Ponzi could no longer deny. Boston awoke to front-page headlines declaring that the Massachusetts Bank Commissioner had officially taken control of Ponzi's company, freezing all remaining accounts at Hanover Trust and prohibiting further withdrawals. The news spread rapidly, carried from house to house, whispered through streetcars and repeated outside corner shops. By the time Ponzi reached his office, the crowd outside had swelled to its largest size yet, stretching down the entire block. Many of the faces were tense and exhausted. Some had spent the night near the building, unwilling to risk losing their place in line. Police maintained a tight cordon to prevent unrest, though the air felt charged with frustration. When Ponzi stepped out of his car, a wave of shouts erupted. Some pleaded with him, others accused him, but all wanted the same thing: certainty. Inside, the office was eerily chaotic. Some clerks sat at their desks staring into piles of useless paperwork, aware that they could no longer process deposits or withdrawals. Others whispered nervously about losing their jobs. A few quietly packed personal belongings, anticipating that the company would not reopen again. State officials arrived shortly afterward, delivering the commissioner's formal notice. The Securities Exchange Company was suspended indefinitely pending investigation. Ponzi, still calm, insisted on speaking with them privately. He argued that the suspension was premature, that he could prove solvency if given the chance, and that the market panic was the true cause of the withdrawals. But the officials remained unmoved. They informed him that a full audit was underway, and that any attempt to interfere would be treated as obstruction. As they departed, Ponzi returned to his desk and sat in silence. It was the first moment in many months where he had no immediate task, no checks to sign, no crowds to greet, no reporters to charm. His empire, once powered by relentless momentum, had simply stopped. The stillness felt unfamiliar, almost surreal. Outside, the crowd continued pressing for answers. Many shouted that Ponzi should come out and speak to them, but he remained inside, knowing he could offer nothing reassuring. His lawyers soon arrived, requesting an urgent meeting. They explained that federal prosecutors were preparing formal charges for mail fraud. The evidence gathered by postal inspectors, documents, ledgers, investor statements, was strong enough to move forward immediately. Ponzi listened with a stoic expression, though each word chipped away at the denial he had been holding on to. Later that afternoon, the Boston Post released another article estimating the true scale of the collapse. According to their calculations, as many as 40,000 people might have invested in Ponzi's scheme, with total losses potentially surpassing $15 million. These numbers shocked even those who had followed the story closely. By evening, the streets around Hanover Street were filled not just with investors, but with curious onlookers trying to witness the downfall of the man who had captivated Boston for months. And through it all, Ponzi remained inside, moving slowly through the dim office, pausing occasionally to rest a hand on a desk or glance at a ledger. The walls seemed to hold echoes of better days, of admiration, excitement, and belief. But now they felt like the interior of a ship taking on water, moments from sinking. As night settled, Ponzi stepped outside for a brief moment. The crowd, though thinner now, still watched him intently. For the first time, he did not speak. He simply nodded once, then left through the back door, knowing the next day would bring consequences he could no longer postpone. On the morning of August 16th, 1920, the collapse of Charles Ponzi's empire became impossible to ignore. Newspapers across Boston carried bold headlines announcing that federal authorities were now fully involved, and the tone of the coverage had shifted sharply. What had once been presented as a remarkable financial mystery was now described openly as a fraud under investigation. As Ponzi drove toward his downtown office, he noticed the change immediately. The crowds were still there, but the energy had turned cold. People no longer waited with hopeful expectation. They watched with suspicion, anger, and disbelief. Police had expanded their presence, forming tight boundaries around the building to prevent unrest. When Ponzi entered the office, he was met with grim expressions from his remaining employees. Those who still worked there had done so out of loyalty or hope, but the atmosphere now felt resigned. Some desks were empty, others cluttered with half-filled withdrawal forms that could no longer be processed. The phones rang non-stop, but few dared to answer, knowing the callers wanted explanations no one could give. Shortly after his arrival, federal agents entered the building and requested a private meeting. In a calm, measured tone, they informed Ponzi that the U.S. Attorney's Office was preparing to file charges against him for mail fraud, and that his cooperation would be expected moving forward. They asked him to hand over records, correspondences, and financial documents. Ponzi, maintaining the same composure he had shown throughout the crisis, agreed to comply. Yet inside he felt the weight of inevitability settle firmly on his shoulders. Outside, word of the federal involvement spread quickly, fueling panic among the crowd. Some investors cried openly, while others lashed out at officers for refusing to let them inside. The trust Ponzi had once inspired in thousands had crumbled almost overnight, replaced by fear and anger that now pulsed through the streets like a collective heartbeat. Inside the office, Ponzi's lawyers urged him to consider his options. They explained that the evidence gathered by postal inspectors was overwhelming, that the federal government was prepared to move quickly, and that resisting would only worsen his situation. They advised him to negotiate, to seek leniency in exchange for cooperation. But Ponzi struggled to process the advice. Even now, on the brink of collapse, he found it difficult to accept that everything he had built was ending. He believed, on some level, that his original idea had been genuinely innovative, that if circumstances had been slightly different, if the system had given him more time, he could have transformed the operation into a legitimate enterprise. Yet belief could no longer change the reality unfolding around him. By early afternoon, the state announced the official closure of the Securities Exchange Company, pending further investigation. When employees heard the news, many quietly gathered their belongings and left. A silence settled over the office as desks emptied, chairs were pushed back, and footsteps echoed through the hall. Ponzi remained in his chair, staring at the notice taped to the front door by officials. He read it several times, even though the message was painfully clear. His company was finished. As evening approached, only a few staff members remained. Ponzi stood and walked slowly through the now quiet rooms, touching the backs of chairs, glancing at scattered papers, remembering the energy that had once filled the space. Just weeks earlier, this office had been a symbol of success, a place where people believed their dreams could grow. Now it felt like a monument to everything that had slipped away. When Ponzi finally stepped outside, escorted by officers, the crowd burst into shouts, some angry, some confused, some pleading. He paused for a moment, looking at the faces that had once trusted him completely. Then, without another word, he allowed himself to be led away, knowing that the next chapter of his life would be decided not by promises, but by the law. The morning of August 17th, 1920, unfolded with a heavy inevitability as Charles Ponzi faced the consequences he had spent weeks trying to outrun. Overnight, news of the company's closure had swept through Boston, and by sunrise the entire city seemed to be talking about the man who had once promised unimaginable returns. Crowds still gathered around Hanover Street, though now they appeared not out of hope, but out of curiosity and frustration. Many wanted to see Ponzi in person, perhaps to demand explanations, perhaps simply to witness the final moments of a story that had captivated the city for months. When Ponzi arrived at the office, accompanied by police officers and his attorneys, the crowd erupted into shouts. Some called him a liar, others begged for their money back. But for the first time, Ponzi did not attempt to address them. He moved quietly through the doors, his shoulders slightly lowered, aware that any words he offered would be swallowed by anger. Inside, federal agents were already waiting. They asked him to gather remaining documents, explain inconsistencies in the ledgers, and identify where specific funds had gone. Ponzi responded calmly, though his answers often repeated the same refrain. The paperwork was incomplete, the operations were still being organised, and delays had created confusion. The agents, expressionless, continued their questioning, documenting everything with methodical precision. By midday, the US Attorney's Office announced that formal charges were imminent. The primary accusation would be mail fraud, stemming from Ponzi's use of letters and advertisements to solicit investments. Despite the complexity of the scheme, the legal foundation was simple. Ponzi had used the postal system to make promises he could not fulfill. Outside the building, the crowd swelled further as news of the impending arrest spread. Reporters hurried to the scene, scribbling notes, taking photographs, and interviewing investors who recounted how they had trusted Ponzi with everything they had. A few still insisted he was innocent, arguing that the government had sabotaged him, but most spoke with disappointment or anger. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Ponzi's lawyers pulled him aside. They explained that resisting the charges would be futile, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that negotiating a plea might reduce the severity of his sentence. Ponzi listened quietly, feeling a mix of resignation and disbelief. He had always imagined himself as someone capable of overcoming any setback, someone who could bend circumstances to his will through determination and charm. But now, for the first time, he realized that the narrative had slipped entirely out of his hands. Toward evening, federal agents informed Ponzi that he was officially under arrest. He nodded once, saying nothing, and allowed them to escort him through the back door to avoid the furious crowd. Flashbulbs burst as soon as he appeared. Reporters shouted questions, but Ponzi kept his gaze lowered, stepping into the waiting car with solemn composure. As the vehicle pulled away, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind only scattered voices and the echo of a story that had reached its breaking point. And for Ponzi, the next chapter, one he could no longer shape or delay, was about to begin inside the walls of a courtroom. On August 18th, 1920, the full weight of the legal system closed around Charles Ponzi as he was formally charged with multiple counts of mail fraud, marking the shift from speculation to definitive accusation. The courtroom was crowded before the session even began. Reporters lined the aisles, eager to capture every detail, while curious citizens filled the benches, hoping to witness the next chapter of a story that had consumed Boston. When Ponzi was led inside, He carried himself with a quiet composure, though his eyes revealed a fatigue that had grown steadily over the past days. The charges were read aloud in a calm, steady voice. Ponzi had used the postal system to send letters and advertisements that promised extraordinary returns, knowing he could not deliver on those promises. The legal language was technical, but the meaning was clear. His empire had been built on claims that could not be sustained. As the judge reviewed the accusations, Ponzi's attorneys advised him to plead not guilty for the time being, allowing them time to negotiate and prepare. Ponzi agreed, understanding that any other approach would be premature. After the hearing, he was released on bail, though the amount, set at an unprecedented figure, reflected the seriousness of the charges and the massive financial losses attributed to his scheme. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him immediately, thrusting microphones and notebooks toward him. Ponzi paused, offering a brief statement. His voice remained steady as he insisted that he intended to fight the accusations and prove that he had never meant to deceive anyone. He claimed that circumstances had been distorted, that investigations had fueled panic, and that people had misunderstood the scale and potential of his business model. Yet even as he spoke, few in the crowd seemed convinced. Many investors who had once praised him now stood silently in the background, watching with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. They had trusted him with their savings, believing in his confidence and charisma, and now they were left wondering how much they had truly lost. Over the next several days, federal investigators continued assembling evidence. They interviewed employees, reviewed correspondence, and collected thousands of documents from Ponzi's office. The portrait forming in these reports was consistent, a financial structure that depended entirely on constant new investments, with no sustainable source of profit beneath it. Meanwhile, the Boston Post published detailed estimates of investor losses, suggesting that tens of thousands of people had been affected. The story ignited public debate throughout the city. Some argued that Ponzi had been reckless, others that he had been malicious, and a few insisted he had been unfairly targeted by regulators. Ponzi, now confined largely to meetings with his lawyers, spent long hours reviewing cases, listening to legal advice, and reflecting on the whirlwind rise and collapse of his enterprise. In quiet moments, he thought about the early days of his idea, when he had genuinely believed he could build something innovative. But those thoughts collided with the reality now facing him. A courtroom, a mountain of evidence, and a city that had transformed from adoration to judgment. As August continued, the legal proceedings moved steadily forward, carrying Ponzi toward a future defined not by dreams of success, but by the consequences of promises he could no longer defend. In the days following his indictment, Charles Ponzi found himself living in a strange, suspended reality. No longer the celebrated financial genius of early summer, yet not fully the convicted fraudster he feared he would soon become. Instead, he existed in a quiet space between past and consequence, spending most of his time meeting with attorneys, reviewing charges, and attempting to prepare for the legal battle ahead. Though he was technically free on bail, the freedom felt hollow. Everywhere he went, he sensed eyes on him. Reporters followed him constantly, watching for any sign of instability or confession. Investors, some angry, some heartbroken, approached him in public, asking why, asking how, asking if there was any chance they might get their money back. Ponzi answered as calmly as he could, though each encounter deepened the weight he carried. Meanwhile, investigators continued to uncover details that only complicated his situation further. They discovered that Ponzi had recently taken out a substantial loan from a local banker, using his home as collateral. The timing of the loan raised suspicion, suggesting that Ponzi had been aware of the collapse long before the public knew. Prosecutors argued that it indicated intent to protect personal assets, though Ponzi's attorneys insisted it was merely a precaution taken during a period of uncertainty. As evidence accumulated, the public mood shifted even more decisively. Newspapers ran lengthy analyses, explaining in simple terms how Ponzi's scheme worked and why it had been destined to fail. Opinion pieces debated whether he had begun with good intentions or whether a deception had been part of the plan from the start. Letters to editors arrived by the dozens, some angry, some sympathetic, some urging lawmakers to strengthen financial regulations so such a disaster could never happen again. At home, Ponzi tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for his wife, Rose. She remained loyal, visiting him during legal meetings and offering quiet reassurance. Yet she too could see how drastically their lives had changed. Their home, once a symbol of newfound success, now felt like a fragile bubble waiting to burst under the pressure of debt, scrutiny, and public judgment. At night, Ponzi found himself lying awake, replaying the rise and fall of his empire. He thought often about the early investors who had believed in him without hesitation. He remembered their stories, their hopes, their relief when he handed them their first profits. Those memories haunted him now, moments of genuine connection overshadowed by the knowledge that he had ultimately failed them. His lawyers advised him to consider a plea deal. The evidence, they explained, was overwhelming, and a trial would only amplify the public spectacle. A guilty plea, accompanied by cooperation, could significantly reduce his sentence. Ponzi listened carefully, weighing pride against practicality. Yet even as he began leaning toward their advice, he struggled with the idea of admitting guilt so openly. He had built his identity around resilience and belief in the impossible. Surrendering felt like giving up the core of who he was. As September approached, the city's attention settled firmly on the coming court proceedings. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ponzi as he entered or exited the building. Inside, prosecutors prepared their final arguments, reviewing the vast collection of documents and testimonies gathered over weeks of intense investigation. And Ponzi, now fully aware that his fate was no longer in his hands, prepared for the moment when he would step before a judge and confront the consequences of a dream that had spiraled far beyond his control. As September 1920 began, the legal tide surrounding Charles Ponzi grew stronger with each passing day. Court hearings were scheduled, motions were filed, and the U.S. Attorney's Office worked tirelessly to organize the thousands of documents that illustrated the true nature of his scheme. The public, which had once lined Hanover Street with hope and admiration, now gathered outside the courthouse in anticipation, eager to witness the next chapter of a story that had transformed from financial miracle to spectacular downfall. Ponzi arrived at each hearing with his characteristic composure, wearing polished suits and maintaining the same calm expression that had once inspired so many investors. But beneath the surface he felt the pressure intensifying. The courtroom, with its stern wooden benches, solemn atmosphere, and unblinking observers, felt like a place where illusion could not survive. The prosecutors presented evidence with meticulous clarity, showing how Ponzi had used the mail to distribute glowing promises of profit, knowing they could not be fulfilled. They detailed the enormous gap between the number of postal coupons he claimed to use and the minuscule quantity actually in circulation. They presented letters from investors, bank statements, and expert analyses, all pointing toward a structure built not on innovation, but on constant inflows of new money. Ponzi's attorneys countered by framing him as an ambitious immigrant who had been overwhelmed by success rather than driven by deceit. They suggested that he had intended to create a legitimate financial model, but had been overtaken by logistical limitations and unexpected growth. Their arguments painted him not as a villain, but as a dreamer who had lost control. Though sympathetic in tone, these defences struggled against the sheer volume of evidence. Outside the courtroom, the media coverage became relentless. Headlines speculated about the length of the sentence he might face. Editorials debated whether Ponzi represented a failure of regulation or a failure of judgment among the public. Some stories highlighted individuals who had lost their savings, many of whom now stood outside the courthouse during hearings, hoping for closure. Inside his Lexington home, the pressure weighed heavily on Ponzi and his wife. Rose tried to remain supportive, preparing meals, attending hearings when allowed, and offering quiet encouragement. But even she could sense that the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Their once grand home, filled only weeks earlier with optimism and visitors, had become a place of tense silence. At night, Ponzi found himself pacing through the rooms, recalling the early days of his plan, before the crowds, before the newspaper attacks, before the investigations. He remembered holding the first postal coupon in his hand, believing he had discovered something brilliant. Those memories felt distant now, overshadowed by the knowledge that he would soon face sentencing. As the hearings continued, Ponzi's attorneys approached him with a final recommendation: accept a plea deal. The evidence was too substantial, they explained, and a trial would only worsen the outcome. A guilty plea could reduce the number of counts and potentially shorten the sentence significantly. After days of deliberation, Ponzi agreed. The decision brought a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He knew that pleading guilty meant accepting responsibility publicly, but he also knew that fighting the charges would only prolong the suffering for everyone involved. And so, with the courtroom waiting and the city watching, Ponzi prepared to take the next irreversible step toward the end of his extraordinary and turbulent rise. When Charles Ponzi returned to the federal courthouse to enter his plea, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. The building was surrounded by onlookers, former investors, reporters, and curious citizens who had followed his story from meteoric rise to abrupt collapse. As he stepped through the doors with his attorneys, flashbulbs burst around him, capturing the moment that would officially mark the end of his short-lived financial empire. Inside, the courtroom was silent as Ponzi approached the bench. His attorney stood close, reminding him of the plan they'd carefully crafted: plead guilty to a limited number of mail fraud counts, avoid a lengthy trial, and hope for a lenient sentence. Ponzi listened, then nodded calmly, accepting that this was the only rational path forward. When the judge asked for his plea, Ponzi spoke clearly: guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, final and irreversible. A ripple of murmurs spread among the spectators. For months the public had debated his intentions. Was he a genius undone by circumstance, or a swindler from the beginning? With a single word, Ponzi had answered, ending the speculation. The judge reviewed the plea agreement, noting the immense scale of the losses and the number of people affected. Though the agreement reduced the total number of charges, the severity of the case could not be overlooked. After a brief pause, the judge delivered his sentence: 5 years in federal prison. Some gasped at the length. Others whispered that it was lenient, given the size of the scheme. Ponzi himself remained composed, exhaling slowly as if finally acknowledging the weight he had been carrying for months. Once the hearing concluded, guards escorted him out of the courtroom. The hallway outside was filled with reporters, calling his name, asking for a statement. Ponzi paused briefly and offered a few calm words. He accepted the judge's decision, wished no harm to anyone, and hoped someday to rebuild his life. Then he was guided into a waiting vehicle that would transport him to the federal penitentiary. For Boston, the sentencing marked the end of one of the city's most astonishing episodes. Newspapers quickly released special editions describing the hearing, and people gathered in cafes and on street corners to discuss the outcome. Some felt vindicated, others felt betrayed. Many simply felt relief that the confusion and chaos of the past months had finally reached a conclusion. But for Ponzi, the story was far from over. As the gates of the prison closed behind him, he stepped into a quiet world of routine and confinement, carrying with him the memories of an extraordinary rise and the painful knowledge of how swiftly it had all unravelled. Yet even then, a spark of determination lingered within him, an enduring belief that his story, however tarnished, was not finished yet. Life inside the federal penitentiary brought Charles Ponzi into a world far removed from the bustling offices, crowded streets, and constant attention that had defined the previous months. The noise of investors demanding answers was replaced by the steady rhythm of prison routines: waking at dawn, working assigned tasks, eating simple meals and retiring early to a narrow cot in a quiet cell. For the first time in years, Ponzi found himself without the pressure of maintaining an illusion. There were no ledgers to balance, no reporters to charm, no investors to reassure. The absence of these responsibilities created a strange sense of relief, though it was woven with deep regret. During his first weeks in prison, Ponzi spent long hours reflecting on the sequence of events that had led him here. He replayed moments from the early days of his idea, when he truly believed that postal arbitrage might change his life. He remembered the excitement of welcoming his first investors, the crowds growing outside his office, and the feeling that he had finally discovered the path he had been searching for since arriving in America. These memories, though tinted with guilt, were also reminders of a time when his ambitions had felt pure. Yet the weight of his actions was impossible to escape. Ponzi received letters from former investors, some expressing anger, others sharing stories of hardship caused by the collapse. A few even wrote with surprising compassion, insisting they bore him no ill will. Ponzi read each letter carefully, often more than once, feeling the emotional impact of every word. In the prison yard, fellow inmates recognized him instantly. Some approached with curiosity, others with amusement, intrigued by the man whose name had become synonymous with financial deception. Surprisingly, many treated him with a kind of respect, perhaps because he carried himself with calm dignity, or because his story had captivated the country. Ponzi did not boast about his past, but neither did he hide it. He spoke openly when asked, acknowledging his mistakes without dramatizing them. Over time, he settled into a routine. He worked in the prison library, organizing books and assisting inmates who struggled with reading. He found comfort in the quietness of the task and took pride in helping others navigate the shelves. In the evenings, he wrote letters to his wife, Rose, who remained supportive despite the upheaval. Her words brought him solace, reminding him that his life outside prison still existed, waiting for him when his sentence ended. Ponzi also spent much of his time revisiting the idea that had started everything. He analysed the flaws in his original plan, scribbling notes in small notebooks, imagining how he might redesign the concept if given a second chance. Though he knew such dreams were unrealistic, they offered him something he had always survived on: hope. As the month passed, Ponzi earned a reputation as a well-behaved inmate, respectful toward guards and cooperative with prison staff. His sentence, though long enough to change the course of his life, unfolded with a steady calm that allowed him space to reflect. And while the outside world moved on, Boston rebuilding trust, investors rebuilding savings, Ponzi remained suspended in this quieter chapter, contemplating what might come after freedom, knowing that when the cell door eventually opened, he would face a future shaped by both the rise that made him famous and the fall that made him unforgettable. As the years in federal prison passed, Charles Ponzi settled into a rhythm that felt strangely stable compared to the chaos of his former life. Though the outside world had labelled him a swindler, inside the prison walls he became something different, an inmate known for his intelligence, his calm demeanour, and his willingness to help others. He spent long hours in the library, answering questions from fellow prisoners, assisting with letters, and discussing ideas that, in another life, might have become business ventures. The routine softened the constant tension he had lived under before his arrest, giving him the space to think clearly for the first time in years. Yet time did not erase the weight of responsibility he felt. News occasionally reached him about former investors who were still struggling, families who had lost their savings, and legal battles initiated by those who demanded restitution. Each story struck him deeply, reminding him of the immense consequences of decisions he had once convinced himself were temporary solutions. Despite this, Ponzi clung to the idea that he had not begun with malicious intent. In quiet moments, he revisited the memory of holding that first postal coupon, believing he had found a genuine opportunity. He told himself, again and again, that the scheme had spiraled only when demand exceeded the system's capacity. Whether this was a justification or a sincere belief remained known only to him. When his sentence neared its end, Ponzi felt a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The outside world had changed dramatically, and he knew he would not be welcomed back with admiration. Still, he hoped for a fresh start, perhaps somewhere quiet where the past did not define every conversation. But freedom arrived with complications he could not avoid. Upon release, he was immediately taken into custody by Massachusetts authorities, who intended to prosecute him under state law. Though he had already served federal time, state charges related to additional fraud counts still remained. Ponzi found himself returning to courthouses, lawyers, and hearings once more. His wife, Rose, supported him during this new legal struggle, visiting him regularly and offering reassurance. Their marriage, strained but intact, became a source of strength that helped him endure another wave of uncertainty. Ultimately, the state sentenced Ponzi to additional time, though less severe than the federal term. He served part of it before being released on bail while appealing the decision. For a brief period, he tasted freedom in Boston again, but the city was no longer the same place that had once cheered for him. Strangers recognized him instantly, some out of curiosity, others with resentment, and newspapers tracked his movements closely. Ponzi realized quickly that rebuilding a life there would not be possible. As legal proceedings continued, federal immigration authorities stepped in, arguing that Ponzi should be deported as an undesirable alien due to his convictions. Their case gained momentum, and Ponzi soon found himself facing yet another battle. The fight to remain in the country he had once believed would reshape his destiny. These months of partial freedom were filled with uncertainty. Ponzi stayed mostly out of the public eye, relying on the support of Rose and a few loyal friends. But deep down he sensed that the chapter of his life tied to America, its hopes, its crowds, its dreams, was nearing its end. And though he had once arrived with unshakable optimism, he now faced the possibility of leaving it behind under circumstances he had never imagined. As Charles Ponzi waited for the final decision on his deportation case, his life unfolded in a strange limbo, neither fully free nor fully imprisoned, neither welcomed by the public nor entirely cast out. The appeals process dragged on for months, with lawyers arguing over technicalities and jurisdiction. Ponzi, who had once commanded the attention of entire crowds, now lived quietly, moving cautiously through a world that viewed him with suspicion. Newspapers continued to report on his every step, often with critical or mocking tones. Headlines speculated about where he might go if deported, whether he had hidden assets abroad, and what his next move might be. Ponzi tried to ignore the relentless coverage, but it followed him everywhere. Even simple errands, buying groceries, walking through a neighborhood, were interrupted by stares or whispered comments. Despite the public scrutiny, Ponzi remained determined to defend his right to stay in the United States. He argued that he had already paid his debt through his federal sentence, and that deportation would be an unfair second punishment. His lawyers echoed these arguments in court, insisting that the charges did not legally justify removal. His wife, Rose, stood by him through every hearing, offering silent support. But outside the courtroom, the landscape was shifting. Politicians, influenced by public anger over the scheme, pushed for stricter immigration laws to prevent similar cases. Many argued that Ponzi's actions had harmed thousands, and that allowing him to remain in the country would set a dangerous precedent. Eventually the authorities prevailed. A judge ruled that Ponzi should be deported to Italy, citing his criminal record and the widespread impact of his scheme. When the decision was announced, Ponzi remained composed, though a shadow passed over his expression. He had left Italy decades earlier seeking opportunity and reinvention. Now he was being sent back under the weight of scandal. While awaiting deportation, Ponzi attempted one final venture. Knowing he had little time left in the US, he travelled to Florida, where he promoted a new business idea involving investments in land that he claimed would soon triple in value. The plan attracted moderate interest, especially from those who still found him charming and persuasive. But once reporters discovered his involvement, the venture collapsed almost immediately, prompting another wave of investigations. Florida authorities charged him with violating state securities laws, and Ponzi was arrested yet again. This time, the charges led to a short prison sentence in the state penitentiary. When he was released, immigration officials wasted no time. They took him into custody and arranged for his removal from the country. In October 1934, Charles Ponzi was placed on a ship bound for Italy, leaving behind the land where he had risen spectacularly and fallen just as dramatically. As the ship drifted away from the port, Ponzi stood on deck watching the coastline shrink into the horizon. The city lights flickered like distant memories of dreams, crowds, applause, and consequences. He knew he would never return. Ahead of him lay an uncertain future in a country he had once left searching for something greater. And though he carried regret, he also carried a lingering spark of the ambition that had shaped his life, unsure whether it would lead to redemption or simply to the quiet end of an extraordinary chapter. When Charles Ponzi returned to Italy in 1934, he stepped onto the docks of Naples as a man both infamous and forgotten. In America, his name had become synonymous with deception. In Italy, decades had passed since he'd last walked its streets. The country he returned to was very different from the one he'd left as a young dreamer seeking opportunity across the ocean. Now, under the rule of Mussolini, Italy was filled with propaganda, tension, and strict government control. Ponzi, older and carrying the weight of scandal, found that the possibilities he once imagined no longer existed. Despite this, he attempted to rebuild a life. Reporters in Italy were curious about him, and his early days back home were marked by scattered interviews, each filled with questions about his American scheme. Ponzi spoke openly, often highlighting the brilliance of his original idea and downplaying the chaos that followed. He argued that his concept had been misunderstood by regulators, insisting that with proper support he might have created a revolutionary financial system. But while his explanations drew interest, they did not lead to stable opportunities. Jobs were scarce, and Ponzi's reputation made meaningful work nearly impossible. Eventually he moved to Rome, where he found temporary work in small offices and translation jobs. For a short period, he was hired by the Italian government to analyse financial data, an ironic twist considering his recent history. Yet the job did not last, and Ponzi soon drifted again, struggling to find consistent employment. Over the next several years, his life followed a steady decline. Friends were few, money even fewer. He travelled briefly to Brazil on behalf of an Italian airline company, helping them manage logistics for routes between Italy and South America. The role offered a glimpse of purpose, but political instability and financial struggles within the company ended the position quickly. When the company collapsed, Ponzi remained in Brazil, unable to return to Italy and unwilling to face the humiliation of starting over once again. As the years passed, he lived modestly in Rio de Janeiro. His health deteriorated, worsened by chronic illness and poverty. Occasionally journalists sought him out, eager to hear reflections from the man whose name had become a symbol of fraudulent schemes worldwide. Ponzi, even in poor health, still spoke with the charm that had once captivated tens of thousands. He told stories of ambition, optimism, and miscalculation, insisting that he had never intended to hurt anyone. He often said, "I gave people the opportunity to believe in something, perhaps too much." By the early 1940s, he was living in a charity-run hospital, supported by donations and the occasional visitor who wanted to hear his story firsthand. Yet even as his circumstances grew more desperate, Ponzi retained a faint echo of his former optimism. He continued writing letters and notes about financial ideas, analysing new global markets, reshaping old concepts. Though none of these ventures materialised, the act of imagining them seemed to sustain him. He remained convinced that his original idea had held a spark of brilliance, one that might have succeeded under different circumstances. In these final years, Ponzi lived quietly, far from the headlines that had once surrounded him. The crowds, the wealth, the offices full of eager investors all belonged to a world that felt distant now, like scenes from another lifetime. Yet what lingered most was not bitterness, but a complex mixture of regret and pride, the two emotions that had long defined the extraordinary arc of his life. In the final chapter of Charles Ponzi's life, the man who once stood at the centre of one of America's most astonishing financial storms spent his days in quiet obscurity, far from the crowds and chaos that had defined his rise and fall. Living in a modest room within a charity-operated hospital in Rio de Janeiro, Ponzi faced illness, poverty, and the slow fading of public memory. Yet despite these hardships, he remained remarkably reflective. Nurses who cared for him later recalled that Ponzi often spoke about his past with a strange mixture of regret and pride. He admitted openly that his scheme had collapsed under its own impossible weight, but he insisted that the idea behind it had been sound, an innovation ruined by execution, not intention. Whether this was self-justification or genuine belief was difficult to tell, even for those who spent the most time with him. Ponzi took comfort in telling stories. When visiting journalists or curious locals asked about his life, he recounted tales of America's bustling streets, the crowds outside his Boston office, and the excitement that surged through the city during the height of his success. He didn't shy away from discussing the collapse, though he often framed it as a tragedy born from ambition rather than deceit. His charisma, though softened by age and illness, still flickered whenever he spoke. In quiet moments, Ponzi wrote letters that were never mailed, letters to old friends, to former investors, even to regulatory officials he once viewed as adversaries. These writings revealed a complicated inner world. He apologized in some, defended himself in others, and in a few he simply reflected on the unpredictability of life. He wondered whether he had been driven more by hope or desperation, more by vision or vanity. Despite his circumstances, Ponzi remained curious about the financial world. He read newspapers whenever he could find them, analysing market trends and making notes as if planning another grand venture. He scribbled ideas about international trade, currency fluctuations, and arbitrage opportunities, though none held the spark or scale of his earlier dreams. The world around him changed rapidly during these years. Nations rose and fell, economies shifted, and new financial scandals emerged. But Ponzi watched from a distance, no longer a participant, only an observer. In January 1949, Charles Ponzi passed away at the age of 66 with little fanfare. His funeral was simple, attended by a small handful of acquaintances and hospital staff. There were no headlines in America marking his death, no crowds gathering on Boston streets as they once had. His passing was quiet, almost symbolic, a stark contrast to the noise and spectacle of his earlier life. Yet Ponzi's legacy endured. Over time, financial textbooks, economic studies, and popular culture would immortalize his name. His scheme, once a singular event, became a universal term used to describe fraudulent structures built on unsustainable promises. And in that strange, unintended way, Ponzi achieved a form of lasting fame few could have predicted. As the decades passed, his story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily confidence can transform into deception, how quickly ambition can outpace reality, and how the human desire for quick prosperity can lead even the rational into dangerous territory. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet echo of his final reflections, remained the image of a man who had dreamed too boldly, climbed too quickly, and fallen with equal speed. Charles Ponzi left behind no fortune, but his name became a permanent part of financial history, an enduring testament to the extraordinary rise and the inevitable collapse of a scheme that promised the impossible.